Hi, everyone. Dr. Taylor here with Healing Restoration's Domestic Violence Ministry. And today I'm going to give you some information on emotional abuse. So, emotional abuse basically involves controlling and manipulating another person with emotionally abusive tactics. And I'm going to expand on that because the tactics don't have to only include emotionally abusive tactics for it to be considered emotional abuse. And again, I will expand on that later. So, with emotional abuse, the behaviors are meant to control, isolate, to frighten, belittle, or to damage someone's self esteem through a variety of measures. But basically, emotional abuse has been inadequately defined, and there needs to be more research done to really define emotional abuse across all different disciplines so that that one definition is basically being applied in every situation. What we do know about emotional abuse is that it can be psychological in nature. It can consist of the abuser trying to confuse the person that is the recipient of the abuse. And this could mean that they're trying to make the person doubt themselves. They could be trying to instill fear in them. And the person having a fog is more of the impact of the psychological abuse and them becoming forgetful as well. The abuser could cause the person to begin to question themselves. Their self esteem can become damaged because of feelings of worthlessness. And there's some gaslighting that usually goes on with emotional abuse, basically trying to make the person or their partner be accountable for their wrongdoing to try to put it back on them. Another example of emotional abuse is lying. Lying actually is a form of emotional abuse. When the person is lying repeatedly to try and manipulate, to control, to blame their partner, and then threatening. Threatening is a form of psychological, emotional abuse as well. And that could be threatening to have their children taken away from them if they don't do what they want them to do, or threatening to report their immigration status, threatening something, threatening to call their job and tell them something to get them fired. That can be another form of emotional abuse. And I will mention threatening a little later as well. So, emotional abuse can also take on a verbal form. It can be name calling, calling the person curse words, calling them out their name. It can be put downs, talking about their body type, calling them fat, too skinny, ugly, too dark, whatever the case may be that they're trying to actually put the person down. It can be in the form of shouting. It can be screaming or yelling. Now, you may say, what's the difference? Well, shouting could be that the person, the aggressor, is raising their voice to try and exert authority and intimidate the person. Screaming and yelling could be that they are not only raising their voice, but it's the tone that they're taking on a very angry, aggressive, violent tone in the way that they're talking to the other person. Emotional abuse, while it is of a psychological nature intended to control, intimidate, frighten, manipulate a person, it can have physical undertones. And what that means is if a person is damaging property, for example, that can be emotional abuse, but it has physical undertones. And that could be because the aggressor or the abuser is sending a strong message that if the person does not comply with whatever it is that they said, told them to do, wants them to do, that what I did to this property is what I'm going to do to you. And that segues into threatening the person with harm. That is a form of emotional abuse, but that has very strong physical undertones. And in some courts of law, that is actually looked at as a form of physical abuse, especially if the person is doing it with a certain posture. They have their fist balled up, they have an open hand ready to slap someone, but they never laid a hand on them. That can also be considered emotional abuse, but physical abuse as well. And I said that I wanted to talk a little bit more about threatening when I talked about the psychological emotional abuse. So, threatening can also be not only when someone is threatening to harm their partner or their spouse, it can also be if they're threatening to harm themselves. That is a form of emotional abuse as well. In other words, if you leave me, then I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to go back on drugs. I'm going to start drinking again, and it's going to be all your fault. That can be a form of emotional abuse as well. And then staring at someone, staring them down. That's emotional abuse. They may not be saying a word, but their eyes are doing all the talking. And their eyes are saying to this other person, communicating to them what they're going to do to them, what they want to do to them, leaving them sometimes in a shroud of mystery as to what are you going to do? Why are you looking at me that way? Looking at them with this kind of you know better look, especially in the presence of other people. Like if they're at a party or at a family member's house and the person does something that the abuser doesn't like, they may give them that look. And depending on what has happened in the past when they got that look, they know what either is coming or what they need to do to prevent it from coming, meaning that they may suffer even more abuse when they get home. Now, another form of emotional abuse, but it takes on a sexual nature, is putting a guilt trip on the partner if she doesn't want to engage in certain sex acts. And we know that abuse can go either way, but again, on this channel, we are talking more about the abuse that goes on from male to female. So that could be emotional abuse, putting on this guilt trip surrounding sex acts. It could be telling others about what's going on in private. That is a form of emotional abuse. Withholding sex in the marriage because she didn't do what he wanted her to do, what he told her to do. And that could be anything. It could be surrounding anything. It could be surrounding money because he didn't get money from her that he wanted to get. It could be that you didn't listen to me when I told you to do something, or it could be that you don't want to perform the sex acts that I want you to perform. Another form of emotional abuse that can be considered of a sexual nature is talking about the person's body parts and sexualizing them, putting them down in that way. Your breasts are not big enough, or they're too small, or your bottom's too big, or it's too small, or something about their body type, but relating it to something of a sexual nature. That's why I'm not pleased with you, and that's why I went and slept with somebody else. Because you don't have what they have, and quite frankly, you don't know how to please me like they do. Another form of emotional abuse that can take on a sexual nature is pornography. Making the wife feel guilty because she doesn't want to engage in watching pornography or doesn't support him watching pornography. And then there's emotional abuse that can be spiritual in nature. And that can be something such as using the Bible, using scriptures to twist the word of God to fit their own abusive tactics. And that can lead to spiritual distress and it can lead to spiritual confusion because the wife is questioning whether or not she's in the right for quote unquote disobeying her husband, or whether or not she's in the right for holding her ground for what she really knows in her heart is right. So, some of the effects of emotional abuse, it can affect your psychological health by leading to anxiety, confusion, depression, self doubt, lead to fear, becoming fearful. As I mentioned before, the person can be in a fog, become very forgetful, which could affect everything. The person can end up with a damaged self esteem, and all of these things or any of these things could lead to self harm. People do end up trying to commit suicide because of the effects of emotional abuse. Some physical effects of emotional abuse are decreased appetite, or it could be increased appetite because the person could undereat or they could overeat, depending on how the emotional abuse affects them. They could have fatigue, increased heart rate, and or blood pressure. That's due to the effect on the sympathetic nervous system. They could have insomnia, so they're not sleeping well at night, nausea, stomach ache, being restless, have unexplained pain, weight loss or weight gain, and something that is not on here but is definitely a probable effect is that the stress in of itself can lead to hair loss. And I did a video on that. And then I already mentioned the impact of the emotional abuse on the person's spiritual health. So, what action can be taken for emotional abuse? The person is encouraged to seek out domestic violence advocates. You can find those online, you can find them at public health agencies, and counseling may be beneficial. I put selective counseling because it's so important to choose a counselor that has experience in working with domestic violence victims or recipients of domestic violence. It makes a difference that the counselor is empathetic to what the person is going through and that they're not going to put them down or try to make them feel guilty, put a guilt trip on them if they want to leave and they don't want to take any more of this abuse. And if it's a person that they're seeking out for spiritual support and or the counseling is offered through the church, it's very important to have that counseling done by someone who is not going to further abuse and manipulate her because of using different scriptures to try and make the person again feel guilty for leaving an abusive situation. The police may need to be involved. There may need to be a court order in the form of a restraining order. And then the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 800-799-7233. And I just want to emphasize that emotional abuse is often a silent form of abuse for the victim or the recipient of that abuse because there are no external factors that can objectively lead to the abuse in the form of any marks on the person. So there may not be a black eye, there's no busted lip. With emotional abuse, because there may not be any physical abuse that's going on, so the person often suffers in silence and a lot of times is not believed when they report different instances of abuse that they have suffered that is emotional in nature. And a lot of times, emotional abuse can be just as damaging and harmful to the person experiencing it than physical abuse. Some women have even said that in some twisted kind of way, it would have been better if they would have been physically abused because then they would have been believed and the perpetrator could have been maybe arrested, or it may have been easier to get a restraining order. So I just wanted to point that out. And finally, what I would like to say is that no form of abuse is ever okay with God. So don't be manipulated, guilted, forced into thinking that abuse is okay and that it's substantiated by the Bible or with the Bible, in the Bible, and that God is going to punish you for leaving an abusive situation. And finally, it may not be you that's going through the abuse. It may be someone that you know that you see some of these signs in. And if that's the case, please reach out to them as well. I pray that this message has been beneficial and informational to someone out there. And as always, until next time, God bless you.